Ancient structures are often admired for their complex designs, enormous stature, and their durability to last over thousands of years. However, there are actually a surprising number of these projects which were abandoned before they could ever become as impressive as those which had been completed. Even structures that are believed to have been finished show signs that they were actually planned to be far more elaborate. Given how much effort had already been put into these projects, it is very strange that they would have been left incomplete. Many of these structures had also been quite damaged, seemingly by earthquakes and flooding. The sheer amount of structures around the world which had been unfinished demonstrates that something may have occurred on a more widespread scale, which prevented these buildings from being completed. In this video, we're going to be exploring these abandoned projects and determining what may have caused these structures to have never been finished. The Barabar Caves in India are a prime example of an elaborate project that was suddenly abandoned, despite all the work that had been put into it. These buildings were in the process of being carved from massive, freestanding boulders. Many of these doorways are intricately designed, while others were left in an intermediate state as simple square doors with square frames cut out around them. These square-cut doors are quite similar in appearance to carvings known as false doors, which are found in other ancient structures around the world, aside from the fact that the doors of the Barabar Caves are actually functional entrances. The interiors of the Barabar Caves are in part extremely smooth and refined, while other sections are still very rough and unfinished. There are no carvings anywhere inside the Barabar Caves, which is very unusual for ancient Indian buildings. The outside of the structure only has a few lightly carved designs, which were obviously supposed to be more detailed and accompanied by many more carvings. The stairs were seemingly meant to be more elaborate also, since those found on most other temples in India are smoother and well designed. As a side note, the white writing and lightly etched words and designs next to the stairs were made by modern people, not those who had initially created the Barabar Caves. There are enormous cracks going through the walls, especially inside the buildings, but also on the outside, that had been created by a strong force such as an earthquake, which acted upon the buildings after they had been hollowed out. It could be assumed that the reason why some of these walls were left unpolished is because the constructors had realized that there were cracks in the stone. If this were to be the case, then why were other walls, also with cracks in them, highly polished and refined? This is indicative of the cracks having formed after the builders had begun their work on the structures. The Mahendravadi Temple in India is another unfinished ancient building that was carved from a giant freestanding boulder. The top portion was going to be carved, as you can see designs lightly etched into it. However, these carvings, as well as the structure itself, were never finished. The inside of Mahendravadi is much more designed than the outside, showing more evidence that there were plans to make the outside more elaborate, especially because, as with other ancient temples in India, more effort is put into the exterior designs than on the interiors. The frame etched around the doorway was only partially carved out, but there is a clear intention to continue carving these frames. Ancient structures in India, which are finished on the other hand, are almost always perfectly symmetrical, based on the way in which many other structures in India have been carved entirely from single masses of stone. It is very likely that the constructors had intended to carve the entire boulder to create a freestanding temple. Also in India, there are two separate cave complexes, Ellora and Ajanta, which are roughly 62 miles apart. The Ajanta caves are more elaborately designed than the Ellora caves. However, neither of these structures were finished, since there are many sections with little to no carvings, where it seems that there should be carvings. The insides of the two separate cave complexes have similar layouts, but while designs are carved on many pillars in the Ajanta caves, there are virtually no designs on the pillars inside of the Ellora caves. Ellora is located right next to the Kailasa temple. While Kailasa is completely covered in carvings, Ellora is very plain. It is clear that there were intentions for the Ellora caves to be thoroughly designed like Kailasa was, but the builders were never able to get around to finishing Ellora. Some of the Ajanta cave pillars have carvings, but most are undesigned as well, indicating that these structures were yet to be finished. Veduvan Koil is a temple made in the same way that the more well-known Kailasa temple was created, in which the structure was carved out of a single mass of stone. But unlike Kailasa, Veduvancoil was never finished. There are some sections of it that are very elaborately carved, while other sections are not carved at all. Some of the portions that were carved were only done so partially. The inside is certainly not finished being carved, as it is very unrefined, and lacking any of the hallmark carvings seen in every finished ancient Indian temple. Veduvancoil was most likely carved from the top down, and while some workers continued to carve out the bottom section, other workers began designing the top part, as well as the surrounding rock walls. There is no indication that any designs had been carved onto the lower sections of the front of the exterior, as of when they had stopped. Egypt is also home to a remarkable amount of abandoned ancient projects, which are rarely discussed despite their interesting implications. One example is the tomb of Queen Kenkaus I, which is the small base of what would have been a pyramid, composed of several layers of large limestone blocks. This structure is more narrow than a typical Egyptian pyramid. Due to its smaller size, it should have been easier to build than most of the other pyramids in Egypt, yet it was never completed. The Kenkaus tomb is situated right next to the three Great Pyramids in Giza, and was even initially believed to be an unfinished fourth pyramid of Giza. The base of the pyramid is a natural rock formation, which the builders had taken advantage of, and they were in the process of covering this outcropping with stone blocks. Carvings were made into the natural stone base, possibly intended to help the stone block casing adhere to the surface. The Pyramid of Baka in Zayet el-Aryan is another structure in which only the square base was ever completed. The shafts and chambers, intended to be constructed beneath the planned pyramid, were never finished, with only the floor of the chamber having been constructed. Another unfinished pyramid in the complex of Zayet el-Aryan is the Layer Pyramid, which stands at only about 56 feet high, but would be over 275 feet tall had it been completed. Based on the angle of slope, it seems to have been intended to become a step pyramid. There is a chamber below the pyramid 85 feet below ground level, which is very deep, and would have taken a lot of effort to construct. However, there is no sarcophagus inside of it, showing that the structure was never used for burial, as it is thought that it was intended to be. A third unfinished pyramid at the complex of Zayet el-Aryan is the Pyramid of Djedefre, which stands at only 37 feet tall now, but was apparently intended to be almost the same height as the Pyramid of Khufu had it been completed. The Pyramid of Abu Sir is another unfinished structure at a different complex in Egypt, named the Abu Sir Complex, and is claimed to be the least finished pyramid that has been discovered so far. It was abandoned just a few weeks after its construction was initiated for a supposedly unknown reason, with even the preparatory work having remained incomplete. This indicates that there had been very unusual circumstances which cut their project off prematurely and abruptly. The Pyramid of Neferefre is another unfinished structure that is also a part of the Abu Sir necropolis complex. The constructors of this would-be pyramid seemed to be in a hurry when attempting to build it, since only the outer layer was made of a high-quality limestone, the rest of it being made of any limestone the builders could quickly gather. Many of the blocks at the Pyramid of Neferefre were left uncut and unrefined as well. The base of the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet, also known as the Buried Pyramid because it has become buried in sand, stands currently at only 26 feet high, but it would have been over 230 feet high had they finished it. There is an incomplete burial chamber beneath the base of the pyramid, as well as a large passageway about 200 feet in length, leading from the north of the buried pyramid. According to Egyptologists, the Maidum Pyramid south of Cairo is another unfinished ancient structure in Egypt. It is still one of the most easily recognized pyramids, since it was more completed than the unfinished structures mentioned previously. It has been claimed that the step pyramid portion of Maidum was going to be covered in a smooth layer of bricks to turn it into a straight pyramid. It is currently 213 feet high, and it would have been 300 feet tall had it been finished, meaning that it's only 2/3 of the height that it was intended to be. This section inside the Maidum Pyramid was meant to resemble the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid of Giza, but it was not completed. The inscriptions inside of the pyramid were never finished either. The interior blocks were completely unrefined, which indicated that they were cut into rough shapes, put into place inside the pyramid, and then other workers specialized in smoothing stone were planning on refining the blocks at some point. There are also still wooden supports inside the structure. which would have been removed when the Pyramid of Meidum was finished being constructed. The mainstream explanation as to why the builders had halted their construction of these pyramids is that the pharaohs who ordered for them to be built died prematurely, which left the structures incomplete. However, one of the first sections to be built on these pyramids are the burial chambers beneath the structures. If the pharaohs that these pyramids had belonged to died, they still would have been placed into these chambers. The bodies of these rulers are not present beneath these ruins, and some of them, for example the Layer Pyramid, do not even have sarcophagi beneath them. It almost seems as if a very catastrophic event had caused the builders to suddenly perish, and therefore no bodies were placed into the chambers. When you begin to take into account all of the structures around the world that were unfinished, it seems more likely that there had actually been a disaster, which occurred on a widespread scale, that caused these projects to be abandoned. An underwater megalithic site off the coast of a Japanese island called Yanaguni also seems to have been in the process of being carved for some purpose before it became submerged. Some claim that the structure is a building, and others believe that it is an ancient quarry. It is very possible that this structure could have been used as both a building and a quarry. The stone may have been in the process of being cut away to become a building, and as the builders carved the stone, they also took portions of it away to use in other structures, similar to how topsoil is collected and sold as it is removed during modern construction projects. If the Yanaguni monument had been a quarry, however, I have not been able to locate any structures nearby that are made of the same type of stone, being black carbonaceous sandstone. The nearest ancient architecture that is made of this type of rock are the structures of the Angkor complex in Cambodia, which does still demonstrate that this type of rock was implemented in ancient construction projects. Another interesting structure that was abandoned before it was completed is known as Kapila Kaya, where an enormous engraving, erroneously believed to be a false door, is carved into a mountainside in Turkey. This engraving is not actually a false door, but a giant loaf-shaped block carved out from the mountain. It is still partially connected to the mountainside, with the majority being cut away. A gap was cut out around Kapila Kaya in order to prevent moisture from permeating through the stone of the mountain onto the structure. Similar to how buildings in Antarctica are covered in a dome to protect them, rocks were generally made of grains of minerals that had been cemented together by natural processes. The geometric and spatial configuration of the elements and minerals that form rocks, known as their fabric, causes most varieties of rocks to be porous, and therefore making them permeable by water, as liquid is able to move through the connected pores in the stone. Leaving the Kapila Kaya structure connected to the mountain would enable moisture to pass through the rock composing the ridge, and directly into the structure, then moving through the structure and weathering the stone. It would also cause layers of mold to form, as moisture permeated into the chamber that was carved out. The sections of stone around the structure, which were not yet removed as you can tell, allowed water to run onto the stone building. The uncarved portions around the structure are evidence that Kapila Kaya was not finished. The incomplete rectangular cavity leading inside was also not finished being carved away. There are 18 other structures of the same type in Turkey, some of which are more completed, showing what Kapila Kaya was intended to look like. There would have been an overhang on the building itself that would have shielded the rectangular opening from water, like an overhang above a front door on a modern building. The bottom edge around Kapila Kaya was intended to prevent water from collecting around the structure and to drain water away from the building. The design of these structures is quite ingenious, demonstrating that their creators were very knowledgeable about how they could protect these buildings against water damage. A similar structure, called the Gate of the Gods in Peru, is essentially a large outline of a rectangle carved around a smaller T-shaped cutout resembling a doorway, carved into a natural cliffside. The architrave, or mantle, varies in depth, showing that it was not finished being carved. The space around would have served the same purpose as the frame around Kapila Kaya, to protect the building from water damage. On the left side, there is an imprint from the leveling of the surface, which was still in progress, in contrast with the right side, which was more flattened. The doorway itself is cut in a very uneven manner, while the mantle, higher up, is more evenly cut, showing that the structure as a whole was not finished. Modern people speculate that this site was created to be a shrine, hence the supposed false door, but that is only speculation with no real basis. The carving believed to be a false door was probably intended to be a real door leading into a chamber, but it was never completed due to some major disaster that forced the project to be abandoned. Referring back to Kapilakaya, if the rectangular cavity had not been hollowed out at all, it would also be assumed to be a false door. Naupa Iglesia is another unfinished structure carved into the side of a mountain in Peru, which also contains a cutout believed to be a false door or a shrine. However, there are many similar doors carved into naturally formed stone walls across Peru, which actually lead into chambers. This supposed false door was most likely supposed to lead into a room, but the builders never completed the construction. As with the Gate of the Gods, Naupa Iglesia was most likely not intended to be a shrine. It was probably intended to be a much larger building complex, but only the door frames were ever carved. The Longyu Caves in China were also evidently left in an incomplete state. The walls were still in the process of being smoothed out after they were carved. Some sections are much more leveled out than others, indicating that the constructors were going to smooth out all the walls. These caves had become completely flooded, and were unable to be explored until the water was pumped out very recently, as the ruins were only discovered in 1992. The way in which these walls were carved out is the same process that ancient structures in India, Egypt, and across the world were created. The stone was etched away on these other structures too, and then was smoothed out before being carved. All of these reliefs on the walls and the pillars of the Longyu Caves were not created by the original constructors. They were actually made recently by locals in order to attract tourists. This explains why these reliefs depict post-cataclysmic Chinese people from the past several hundred years, rather than whoever had really made these caves before they were flooded. The original builders of the Longyu Caves would not have begun to engrave designs until the walls and pillars were completely smoothed out. So much effort had already been put into creating these caves, yet the builders had suddenly halted the projects. There had clearly been some sort of disaster that completely submerged the Longyu Caves, which would have therefore caused them to become abandoned. The Lycian rock tombs are another set of buildings that have been carved into the sides of mountains in Turkey, and are in the same modern-day country as Kapilakaya. Some of these structures also have gaps cut out around them to prevent water from permeating them from the mountainside. There are still indentations surrounding the less finished structures, which are clearly going to be carved more thoroughly to match the others. These buildings were going to be recessed into the mountainside, the same way that RVs are parked into garages to protect them from the elements. The largest section of these buildings was never finished being carved, as only the top portion was designed, and there is no doorway. The building on the right side in this image was never finished being carved either. The lack of refinement is not due only to erosion, because the other sections are still finely detailed. There were clearly plans to finish carving these buildings and to make them functional and accessible, but despite all the effort that was put into them, their construction was still cut short. Large palace-like buildings, forming what is known as the Agra city, were also carved into stone walls in Saudi Arabia. Several of the buildings of Agra city were clearly unfinished, as only the top portions of these structures have been carved, and some have no entrances yet, which is virtually identical to the conditions of many of the Lycian rock tombs. Interestingly, there is evident water damage on the bottom portions of these structures, seemingly caused by fast-flowing water carrying sediment and other debris. This damage would have been caused by flooding, which scoured these buildings, especially since they were situated at ground level, where the current of floodwaters would be the strongest. If this damage was from wind erosion, the whole surface of the structures would be equally damaged, but only the lower portions are scoured. Similarly to the Agra city in Saudi Arabia and the Lycian rock tombs in Turkey, there are buildings carved into the stone walls of Jordan. Much of the lack of detail on these buildings seems to be due to erosion caused by heavy currents carrying sediment and debris, which scoured away the detail of the rocks, rounding out the shape of the doorways and the patterns that had been etched into the fronts of these structures. The bottom portions of these buildings are far more damaged than the sections that are higher up, showing evidence that the strongest currents were lower down. There is even possible debris from flooding inside the buildings at Petra. There is evidence that there were plans to make the interiors far more elaborate too, as the frames around some of the doorways have patterns engraved into them slightly. These doorways were not even completed though, as they go in only a couple feet at best, not leading into any other rooms. There are also the shapes of pillars, carved roughly into some of the interior walls. In this image, you can see that these window-like carvings on the left were meant to go all the way down, like the ones on the right, but the builders were never able to complete the work. In front of these engravings, there are also unfinished steps that would have led up to them, indicating that they were actually intended to be used as doorways if they had been completed. The floors themselves are also not smoothed out, as they would have been if they were finished, instead remaining very uneven and rugged. Apart from entire buildings which were never completed, there are also many ancient megaliths around the world that were never finished being carved, or used for their intended purpose. One of the most well-known examples is the unfinished obelisk in Egypt. This large stone was almost completely carved into shape when the project was suddenly abandoned. It is claimed that the builders quit carving the obelisk because they had noticed that there was a crack in it. However, there are many other ancient projects worldwide that were completed, and yet they now have large cracks running through them. Some of the walls inside the Barabar caves in India, for example, were finely polished, but there are cracks running through them. If those cracks were present before the walls had been refined, the builders would not have tried to polish the walls, because there would have already been major defects in the material. Even if the unfinished obelisk was abandoned because they realized that there was a crack in the rock, they would have repurposed the parts that they had already carved for another project, since it is not easy to carve stone. It is clear that the crack was made after the obelisk was carved, since the builders had cut dotted lines into the stone, which crossed through the crack. They certainly would have noticed the crack as they were making these lines, if it was present as they were carving them. This indicates that the crack was made by some stronger force acting upon the stone, as it was in the process of being carved. There are also abandoned monoliths in Baalbek, Lebanon, that were in the process of being cut to use, probably for a building. Although these stones do not have any apparent cracks in them, they were abandoned just like the unfinished obelisk. It does not make sense that they would spend so much time to carve these stones if they were not going to use them. There must have been some other factor which caused these megaliths to have been abandoned. These large blocks had also been buried when they were discovered, some completely and others partially. There is another very large block of stone in Egypt near Giza that was also in the process of being cut out, but it was abandoned for unknown reasons. The shape indicates that it was going to be used to cut out a statue. Even though cutting out this large block of stone would have been ambitious, it was not more difficult to do this than to complete larger projects such as the pyramids, which were presumably finished. Scattered across Egypt are also many blocks of stone with saw marks cut into them. It is clear that these blocks were intended to be carved further and used in building projects. Another block of stone that was clearly in the process of being cut out when something caused the builders to abandon it is located in Karahan Tepe in Turkey. There are a large number of T-shaped stone pillars which had been set upright. These pillars are similar to those in Göbekli Tepe, although somewhat less refined. With all of the pillars that had been set up, it is strange that one of them would have been mostly carved out, only to be left there and never used. On an even larger scale than the other blocks discussed previously, there are enormous megaliths at the Yangshan quarry in China, which were clearly in the process of being excavated, but something had prevented those working on the stones from finishing their task. These entire blocks were carved into shape, and all the excavators had left to do was to separate these megaliths from the ground, but then they were just left there, never to be used. In Japan, there is a large block of stone, known as Ishi no Hoden, that was in the process of being shaped and excavated as well in the past, before the work on it was halted. This megalith is also carved into a cube-like shape, but with a unique pointed edge on one side. The top of Ishi no Hoden has been leveled, but debris was deposited on top of it from the disaster said to have occurred in the ancient past. According to Japanese legend, the construction of this stone was abandoned when there was rebellion against God, who sent a catastrophe in return. The Ishi no Hoden megalith is also known as the floating stone, because the edge around the bottom of the stone has been carved away from the ground, with only the center of the bottom remaining connected, giving the megalith the appearance of floating over the small pond it lies in. Ishi no Hoden was not cut into this shape so that it would appear as if it were floating. Rather, it was in the process of being carved and cut away from the ground, to be used in a larger project elsewhere. There is another megalith in Japan, named Masuda no Iwafune, which has been carved in a strange way. The original purpose of this stone remains unknown to this day, probably because it was never finished being carved, so it does not look the way it was intended to. The bottom portion of the side of the stone was still being carved. It is clear that they were still in the process of stripping away stone to make it smooth. This megalith is very similar to another large rock in Japan, named Ishi no Hoden Kofun, which currently seems to resemble a small building. As with many of the unfinished ancient buildings discussed previously, there is a square doorway with a squared frame cut around it, which was likely intended to be refined. The stone was cracked after the rock had been carved, leaving a split in the doorframe. Another rock that was clearly in the process of being carved, but was mysteriously abandoned, is the Al-Nasla rock in Saudi Arabia. The center of the stone was split precisely in half, and one side of the rock is completely smoothed out, with the other side still remaining untouched. A similar object in Peru is a strange megalith near Sacsayhuaman named La Piedra Cansada, with its most defining feature being the steps carved all around it. It is unclear as to what the point of this rock was. It is very similar to the rock in Japan named Masuda no Iwafune, in that the purpose of the carvings on the stone makes no sense, because it was still in the process of being carved, and therefore it does not look the way it was intended to. Some people claim that this megalith was used as a quarry, but if that were the case, then what would be the point of the stairs covering it? Even if La Piedra Cansada was a quarry, then it was not finished being used. As can be said of the claimed quarry site of the Yanaguni Monument in Japan, La Piedra Cansada shares many similarities to another smaller megalith also in Peru called the Sahuide Stone, which appears to many to be a diagram of a nearby site such as Machu Picchu, or perhaps made to test irrigation systems. The Sahuide Stone, in contrast with La Piedra Cansada, seems to be finished. The reason why La Piedra Cansada seems to have not been finished, though, is because it does not yet resemble any known sites or portray accurate irrigation systems of any type, and therefore it does not seem to resemble anything that can be recognized as of this point. There are also many statues from ancient times that were never finished being constructed. Although there are almost 1,000 completed moai statues on Easter Island, there are a large number of moai that were only partially carved out from the rock. No large cracks can be found on these statues that mainstream archaeologists can use to explain why they were abandoned, as they attempt to do for the unfinished obelisk in Egypt. There are many statues in Egypt and Greece that were also left in the same unfinished manner. What would cause these statues to be abandoned after so much work was put into them? The way in which so many of these projects around the world were abandoned and have remained unfinished for thousands of years seems to be due to a massive, widespread catastrophe that occurred in the ancient past. Something happened to make the builders suddenly stop working on these projects, and they were unable to finish them later on. There are many other ancient projects around the world that also seem to have been left unfinished, but I had decided not to discuss each and every one in order to keep the video at a reasonable length. If it were only a few projects that had been abandoned, it could just mean that something had happened locally that drew the builders' attention away from their projects. Since there are buildings, statues, and megaliths around the world that have been suddenly halted in their completion, however, it indicates that something more worldwide had occurred, separate from the unconvincing mainstream narratives that attempt to explain why these projects were deserted. The damage done to these structures indicates that massive earthquakes and flooding, strong enough to damage these stones, had occurred in the past, and happened after these projects had already been started. An astounding number of ancient texts from around the world describe a major disaster in the form of a great flood, which had occurred a little over 4,300 years ago. Perhaps those who had lived before the cataclysm had the specialized ability and tools to carve and transport stone, but whatever technology and techniques they had been using were lost due to this disaster. However, these tools may have been recovered at a later date, which I will be discussing in an upcoming video.